to the book of John, chapter 11. That's where we're going to be reading this morning. If you were here with us last week on Easter service, welcome back. We're glad you're joining us again. My name is Justin May. I serve as one of the pastors here. And we started a new series called Heaven Who Goes There. And then Jacob made the conscious decision to get sick. So I was like, I guess I'll have to preach. But this sermon has nothing to do with that sermon series. This comes from 2 weekends ago when I preached 5 sermons in a row throughout that weekend. And every sermon was about the life of Jesus and just reading a story about Jesus and applying it to our lives. And so that's what we're going to do this morning in John chapter 11. But before we do that, I want to ask you a question. Has anyone in here ever heard the words, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me"? You ever heard that phrase before? Now, here's a better question. Are you ready? Who agrees that that's a true statement? No one? No one? That's because all of us in this room understand that our words matter and that our words are important, and our words, most of the time, hold in them the ability to encourage or the ability to destroy. That words actually matter. Maybe you learned this as a kid. In one way or the other, when a parent came up to you and said, "Why can't you ever get that right?" And those words were powerful and mattered to you. And it shaped who you are today. Or maybe it's on the other end of that, right? And your parents were loving and they told you often, "Hey, you are created in the image of God. He has gifted you with so many abilities and you can do anything in your life you want to do." And those words have shaped you and made you who you are today. Our words, though they're small, they matter. Let me illustrate this for you a little bit differently if you don't agree with me. Back in the 1840s, there was a Hungarian doctor who was studying 2 clinics. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis. And we're not going to say his name again. We're going to call him Dr. S from this point on. And what Dr. S in the 1840s was doing is he studied 2 clinics. One clinic was a bunch of midwives who were, midwife helps through the birthing process of a child. And the other clinic was doctors, physicians who went to school for years. And they were both doing the same thing, just, bringing babies into the world. And what he quickly realized was that, mothers in the clinic where the physicians were dying at a much faster rate. 70% of them were developing an infection and dying. And so he started studying the 2 clinics and what they did differently. And here's the only thing he could come up with. And he couldn't prove his point, but all he could come up with is that the midwives were washing their hands and they were cleaning their utensils. And so he goes to this group of doctors and he says, "Hey, if you were to wash your hands and clean your utensils," he said, "I think you would have a much different outcome." Because what they were doing is after every one of those mothers would die, is they would do an autopsy on them to try to figure out what was going on. And then they would use the same utensils on the women that they were helping to deliver babies. And so obviously in our world, we kind of understand that, right? That washing your hands and cleaning your utensils would have made a massive difference. And you know what the doctors did? Nothing. They said, "You can't prove the point. And so there's no evidence around it, so we're not going to do it." I guess most of you know the results that they kept getting. Though I probably couldn't actually prove the point to you, your words, though they are small, matter. I want to read some of the words Jesus says in John chapter 11 to help us see how words matter. John chapter 11, starting in verse 1. "Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, 'Lord, the one you love is sick.'" Now, We have three siblings, and I can't prove my case here, but I think Martha's probably the oldest, and Mary's the middle girl, and then Lazarus is the baby boy. And they come from a city called Bethany. Bethany is 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, and it means this. Beth is the word house, and the prefix, whatever it is, suffix, someone English major is going to get me for that. That last part means poverty. So what this family, they come from the town known as the house of poverty. So it lets you know a lot about their circumstances. And there's never a dad or a mom mentioned in their family. There's never husbands of Mary and Martha mentioned. So we make the assumption that they're not married. And in the world that they live in, coming from a house of poverty, the only person who can provide for Martha and Mary is their brother, Lazarus. And now he's sick. Do you see the words they sent to Jesus? They sent words to Jesus, and it said, Lord, the one you love is sick. Nice, quick, and short to the point. And it's very interesting. I mean, in today's world, if we wanted to get a message to someone, we would probably call them, right? Unless you're under the age of 35, and then you're paralyzed by a phone call. So you do what? You text them, or let's go back all the way to the Stone Ages. Are you ready? You may even send them an email. But you can get a message to someone instantaneously in the world that we live in, but put yourselves in their shoes. Jesus was some 20 miles away from them. They knew he could do something about it, and so they sent word to Jesus. 20 miles away. It took days. They came from a poor house. They weren't able to hire the greatest, quickest way to get the message there. And so it took time for it to get to Jesus, and they made it short so that he would know to come quickly. The one you love is sick. Verse 4. And when he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. There's a few things inside of this passage that I love. And it's when Jesus hears this message, the one that he loves is sick, what does he do? Well, he stays where he was for how many more days? Someone say it out loud. 2 more days. But it's wait, Jesus, I thought you loved him. And even John in his commentary right there, he puts, Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And yet when he hears that he's sick, what does he do? He just stays where he's at. And that's kind of a tough thing to wrestle with as a Christian, isn't it? Because maybe some of us are in that same boat right now where we've sent a message to Jesus and we're crying out to him and we are still waiting. He's not come as quickly as we thought he should. He's not responding the way that we thought he would. Mary and Martha sent this letter to Jesus knowing that he was the Son of God, knowing that he was the anointed one of God who was going to save all of the world. They knew those things, and they knew he had the authority to speak over the situation. And so they said, come quickly, the one you love is sick. And yet Jesus is not swayed by emotions. Jesus is not swayed by circumstances. Jesus is not swayed by fear. He tells you his first motivator. In this passage, you may notice it pretty quickly in verse 4. He says, no, it is for God's glory. Everybody say God's glory. Jesus' primary motive was not Lazarus living or dying. His primary motive was what? God's glory. And so as we look at the life of Jesus, you and I, if we decide to follow him, have to have a primary focus as well. One not bent by the world that we live in, but one that focuses on glorifying God in our life. And see, that would be difficult sometimes because there'll be times when you come to me and you ask me to do something very specific for you, your family, for the circumstances that you live in. But as a follower of Jesus, I have one primary purpose. And what is it? Not protection, not safety, not wealth, not anything in the world, but what? God's glory. So he's motivated first by that, and we're going to continue to see what else he's motivated by. Verse 8, but Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back. Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they will see by the world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. Notice what happens. Jesus does the majority of his ministry in what we call Galilee. And Galilee is the northern part of Israel. And so the reason why he does his ministry there is because most of those people had already given up on their own religious ability to please God. And so he goes there and he's accepted. His teachings are listened to. But every time he goes to the area called Judea, which is south, where you find the city of Jerusalem, where you find Bethany, where this family is from, every time he goes there, he gets in trouble. The religious people start to try to stone him, is what the disciples say. And so though Jesus is for God's glory, we notice some practical things of what it looks like to live for God's glory. One of the practical ways you and I can live for God's glory is stepping into dangerous situations. So many of us stray away from losing friendships or losing jobs and protecting whatever we think we're trying to build in this world. And yet what does Jesus do? He steps into a dangerous situation for the glory of God. Verse 11. After he said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, and I'm going there to wake him up. And his disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So he plainly told them, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Notice he tells you first motivator of Jesus' life is the glory of God. The second motivator he tells you almost immediately is the belief of others. Did you see it? He said, I'm glad I wasn't there so that God could be glorified, and I'm glad I wasn't there so what? So that you may believe. Right? And so following him, we have to submit ourselves to those same motivators as our highest priorities to glorify God and to help other people believe. It says of Thomas is my favorite disciple. You all probably have your own favorite disciples who follow Jesus, but Thomas is mine. It says he's called Didymus, which in Greek means twin. And if you don't know, I'm a twin. So I love Thomas, and the rest of you singles out there, you're on your own. But we have another nickname in our world and culture for Thomas. Does anyone know the other nickname we call him? Yeah, it's so interesting. We call him Doubting Thomas because of one event in his life. And yet, what did he just say? He said, if Jesus is going to Judea to die, then let all the rest of us go with him and die as well. That doesn't sound like doubting to me, does it? That sounds like it's a little more than just that. And so if you're in here and you're waiting on a message from Jesus and you've prayed and sent to him and you're still waiting, your doubt doesn't define you. Right? Your doubt doesn't even define your faith. For some reason, we let Thomas be defined in his faith by the doubting, and yet that was just one time. And if you're doubting and waiting on Jesus right now, it's an opportunity for you to trust him more, right? To trust him and his will in your life more. Verse 17, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Take away all the spiritual things. You ever seen a dead body that's been there for 4 days. I'm not even talking about a person, but maybe it's a deer on the side of the road. You ever seen that? In a hot culture, what happens to it? It starts to swell. It stinks. It's almost unrecognizable when you go to it. You know, there's flies that are covering it. And when Jesus arrives, it says that that's the state of Lazarus' body. But wait, Jesus, I thought you loved him. I thought you loved his sisters. And yet you've waited. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. Many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. And when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. But Mary stayed at home. Verse 21, Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. If you look up other translations of the Bible, this one says, in the Message version, it says, Jesus, you're late. You didn't show up on time. I have an assumption of these two sisters from this story that they are sassy sisters. And one day I may have to meet them in heaven and apologize for this, but I believe there are lots of context clues that tells us they're sassy. One, we already seen it. Martha goes to meet him quickly, doesn't even let him get into the village. Second, Mary stays where she's at. And so I think they're sassy sisters. There's other things that I'm going to prove it to you, okay? But we're going to practice it together, okay? I'm going to say Martha and Mary, and you say sassy sisters. Are you ready? Martha and Mary. Now you'll have to apologize to them as well. She comes out with this prepared speech of, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. That the one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world. Jesus asked us the same question. Notice he didn't say, I was the resurrection or I will be the resurrection. He uses a very Jewish term and says, I am consistently. I am always the resurrection and the life. And ultimately, the foundation of our faith right now in this room is that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Right? In fact, if he didn't resurrect from the dead, you and I should just go do something else right now, because this faith that we have doesn't matter. And yet he says, I am the resurrection and the life. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn. Notice this, verse 32. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. Have you heard that phrase before? Anybody? We literally just heard it come out of the mouth of Martha, the identical same phrase. Do you know what that lets me know? Lets me know that these sassy sisters for 4 days sat in their house and were going back and forth on this. And they were talking about Jesus, and they were running their mouths to each other about him. And listen, they even had prepared a speech for him when he would arrive. Point proven, right? Everybody agree? We may still have to apologize to the sassy sisters. She comes to him with the exact same plea. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Verse 35, Jesus wept. And the Jews said, see how he loved him. A few interesting things right here. One is, anybody have trouble memorizing the Bible and passages in the Bible? Anybody? Well, let me let you know a little secret, okay? John 11:35 is the shortest passage of all the Bible. It's 2 words. Say, Jesus wept. So now when this dude that's on TikTok comes up to you with a video and says, here's $20, and if you can quote me a passage from the Bible, you can say Jesus wept and take his $20. 50-50 split, bring me half of it, all right? John 11:35, it says, Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and something else. Troubled. Right? Did Jesus feel empathy for these people? Absolutely. But I'm not sure his weeping was just for that. I think there's something else going on behind the scenes that you and I never see that also troubles him in his spirit. What could it be? It's hard to tell. A lack of belief. Just seeing the world that's around him. But he weeps because of it. Verse 37. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of a blind man have kept this man from dying? Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there's a bad odor, for he has been in there for 4 days. He goes to the tomb of his friend and he says, roll the stone away. And Martha says in the King James Version of the Bible, it says, he stinketh, Lord. And so Martha kind of understands the decomposition of a body and says, Jesus, when we roll that stone away, it's not going to be a pleasant experience for any of us. Because she expected Lazarus to do what all dead people do. Stay dead. Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out. His hands and feet were wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Jesus calls out. I've heard preachers preach this passage, and they say that he called out Lazarus first, because if he would have just said, come out, all the people that were there that were dead would have come out of their graves. So he had to say Lazarus first. And how did Lazarus come out of the grave? He said he was still wrapped, right? So here he is, hopping out of the tomb, blindfolded. A body that hasn't pumped any blood for 4 days, a body that's decaying away from itself, a body that hasn't had brain activity for 4 days, all of a sudden is rejuvenated and spoken life into it. It's the cornerstone of our faith in Jesus Christ, that he is the same. He once was dead, but now he's alive. And he does that so that you and I can have an abundant life in his name. Let's wrap all of this up. How did Jesus tell Lazarus to come out? With words. Because words matter. Go ahead, start looking throughout the whole Bible and you'll pretty quickly find it out. How does God create? He doesn't snap his finger. He doesn't blink his eyes. How does he create? He speaks and it exists. And then when he breathed into you and I, you know what he breathes into us? His own spirit. A spirit that then speaks. The words that you and I say have the keys to life and death in them. And we have an opportunity and a choice of how we use them. Do we use them for His glory so that other people can believe? Or we use them for our glory so that we can be benefited? That retreat that I spoke of was that this sermon came out of one of the sermons that weekend. This one. It was a college ministry retreat. There were 76 students from all over the state of Virginia at this retreat. They were from Virginia Tech, from JMU, from VCU, ODU, CNU. And they came to spend a weekend sitting at the feet of Jesus and learning from Him. And so Cindy and I were both there. We didn't have, our children were with the grandparents, and so we were like living it up and enjoying our time and, being totally present with the people that we were there with. And so we started talking to people and asking about their stories. I can't tell you how many of their stories about following Jesus started with words. One of them, she told us, she said, I grew up in a home where I didn't really go to church. I went maybe once or twice before I was 8. I went with my grandparents, but when they died, I never went back. She said, I didn't know anything about Jesus. She said, my freshman year, I was breaking down in my dorm room, crying all the time because my life was a mess. She said, here's what one of my friends said to me. A friend grabbed me by the hand and said, you need Jesus. Let's go to the campus house. That girl sat in that room as a believer who has the promises that Jesus promised that she would never die, even though she may physically die, she'll never die. And she sat there because a friend said, you need Jesus. Powerful words. Another young lady came to this retreat, and she was what she called herself this. I didn't call her this. She called herself agnostic. She said, I want to believe, but I don't know what to believe. She came up to me after the service. We're all over, and she started talking to me. She said, I have never heard that much about Jesus. You know how she got to that retreat? A friend of hers said, hey, we're going to a retreat, the campus ministry, and we're going to worship Jesus and have a good time. I think you'll enjoy it. Will you come with me? She came. She and I sat down, and I showed her in the Bible where she could read the story of Jesus in His life. And you know why she's going to read the story of Jesus in His life? Because a friend stepped into a dangerous situation where she could lose a friendship, right? It's dangerous sometimes to say, I believe in Jesus to those people that you love, because at some point you believing in Jesus will hurt a friendship, and you could possibly lose it. What about you? How many of us in this room sit here as Christians who have believed for 10, 15, 20 years and have never stepped out and spoke bold words in someone's life, spoke words that mattered? Can you do the same thing that a college student can do? And just say, hey, you need Jesus. That's it. Or will you come to church with me? I want to invite anyone in this room, if you don't know who Jesus is and you've never come to follow Him and submit yourself to Him, and you think that this dude up here is really weird and doesn't know what he's talking about, that's okay. I think you're here for a reason, right? I think the Spirit of God will draw you into Him and help you understand Him and help you follow Him. You don't have to know everything. But if you know two things, you need a Savior, right? If you know about sin and you know that you've sinned, you need a Savior. It's time to ask, how do I follow Him? Everyone else in this room who is a Christian, has already submitted yourself to Him, listen to me. Jesus' two primary responsibilities and motivators was this: God's glory and that other people could believe. Will you follow him? Let's pray. God, I love you and thank you for the